Good day and good afternoon to all of those who managed to spare half an hour from this wonderful weather that we have today and continue our journey through the millennium of Russian history. And remember, we were talking about a time of Russia being a place of 3 capitals, 2 dynasties, and 1 religion. Well, we are now on the dynasty number 2, and we're on the capital number 3. So the first capital was Kiev, then it was Moscow. Now, from 1703, we discussed it last time, the capital of Russia became St. Petersburg. Some of you may have been to St. Petersburg either on cruises or visiting by land, as a cultural exchange perhaps, on business, whatever. It's an unforgettable impression. Some of you may have been to Moscow. Moscow is also unforgettable, but in a different way. And if you visit Moscow and you visit Kiev, you would see certain similarities because they're both in the same style. Old Russian style, the old part, of course, of Kiev and the old part of Moscow. St. Petersburg is nothing like that. It was laid out to look Western. It was laid out to look impressive imperial city. It did not evolve from something else. And very few places in Europe in 1703 could be turned out of nothing into a capital of a vast empire. Europe was all carved already. And the place for St. Petersburg, as I mentioned last time, was not the most suitable or inspiring place. It's very flat. There is no scenic countryside around. There is a river, which is useful. It's very marshy. The climate is not particularly enviable, but it was convenient. And it became the jewel of the Russian imperial crown. And of course, nobility moved there. Beautiful palaces were built along the canals. And what you imagine of the Russian glory starts in the 18th century. You seldom imagine old Russia when you talk about Russia. Mostly people imagine would be St. Petersburg and Russian crown, wonderful palaces. That is all 18th century. Prior to that, it would be Kremlin, which now is not really what you imagine when you talk about imperial Russia, because it wasn't. It was Tsarist Russia, but imperial Russia is St. Petersburg. And we talked about the century of women last time, starting with Peter the Great, who was wonderful for Russia in a sense. However, if you read much more recent scholarship, you will find that his character somewhat has been reassessed, saying that he was also oppressive, he was a tyrant, he was sending people to build St. Petersburg. As we say in Russian, there is a proverb that St. Petersburg was built on blood and bones, and that he was really, in a way, a person of two faces, very Western on one side, but very absolute monarch on the other side, with certain tendencies perhaps to absolute despotism. If you want to read books about Peter the Great, I will put in the end of the next talk, the fourth and the last talk on Russian history, I will put a page with various books on different parts of Russian history that I read and I think are interesting for people who are not really scholars of Russian history, but are interested in Russian history. But that's next time. So after Peter the Great, we have women in quick succession. His second wife, Catherine, becoming the first empress of Russia as a woman, Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great. Sorry, it's not Catherine Great, Catherine the First. There's something appeared on my screen that distracted me. So Catherine the First, 2 years on the throne. Then her son and son of Peter was only for 3 years, unfortunately died very young on the eve of his wedding, Peter II. After that, there was Peter's niece for 10 years, Anna. You had Queen Anne in Britain. We had Anna on the throne of Russia, our own Anna, for 10 years. Nothing was happening, reactionary period. Then came the daughter of Peter, 22 years, Elizabeth. Elizabeth's name of Elizabeth in Britain probably is also associated with glory. Elizabeth I, now Elizabeth II. Elizabeth in Russia is associated with fun. She was a fun empress. The palaces that you see now, that people take endless selfies and very photogenic Instagram photos, that's Elizabeth. A lot of it was built during Elizabeth's time, what is called Elizabethan Baroque. Her main legacy was not in laws, not in territorial acquisition. Her main legacy was in architecture. She invited Italian architects in particular to beautify St. Petersburg. She had thousands of dresses. She liked fireworks. She never married, like Elizabeth I of Britain, never thought there would be somebody equal to her. And she needed an heir. And she spotted an heir who was her nephew, son of her sister. Her sister was married to a German prince of Schleswig-Holstein, which is on the Baltic coast. Small principality at the time, perhaps nowhere as significant, obviously, as the Russian Empire. She invited him and picked up a wife. I mentioned it last time. Catherine, her full name was Sophia Augusta of Angst-Zerbst, from a small principality, sort of one castle, three houses principality in the middle of current Germany. Nobody really bothered about it at that time, apart from that the Germany or German principalities was a real market of brides for the Russian tsars. Why Germany? Because they could convert. Catholics would not convert. Anglicans would not convert either. However, German Protestants would, and that provided strong links with Germans. And that continued through the 19th century as well. When the last Tsar, Nicholas II, died, it was said he only had 2% of Russian blood, 2%. It was so diluted by the German blood that it was said that actual Slavic blood that he had left is only 2%. Interesting, isn't it, how it works on DNA level. Of course, his wife was also German, Alexandra, that lost her life in 1918. So, Catherine, we talked about her, that was the last thing we talked last week. Catherine, who acquired the nickname as Catherine the Great. Not supposed to have been on the throne on her own at all. She meant to be a regent after her husband died or was killed, should we say, in 1762, and her son was small. When her son reached the age of 18, by 1770s, she should have stepped down. She should, but she didn't. And there were uprisings all over Russia. And that's the woman I'm talking about, Catherine. Here is her fleet, and the greatest acquisition that she did was this. She moved to the west even further than Peter the Great. Peter the Great got that bit on the top. I don't know if you can see my mouse. If not, then Peter the Great got the orangey bit on the very top where the Baltic Sea is. The slightly different shade of brown that's what Catherine got, including the Black Sea coast. Please have a look carefully at the south and the west. You can see that Poland ceased to exist. Poland was divided 3 times, finally in 1795. The eastern part, including Warsaw, went to Russia. South went to Austria, and the west went to Prussia. She increased by treaty and threats of war. The south, where is Ukraine now and the Crimea, and Northern Caucasus, that was by military involvement. And that land around the Black Sea, and I repeat it because nowadays it all resonates in history. That part was mainly populated by the Muslim in religion, Turkic-speaking Tatars, who were under the direct protectorate of the Ottoman Empire. They were a remnant of the Golden Horde, Mongolo-Tatar horde that came there in 1240s and stayed there up to 1770s when Catherine finally brought the military power of Russia down there. They are still there. Tatars still live there. I'm from the Crimea, from the very south, myself. And Crimea of my childhood, which was 70s, 80s, didn't have many Tatars because in 1944 they were all sent away. Crimea of my mother's childhood and my grandfather's childhood was half Tatar, so they were still very much there. And they were Russians. Russian-speaking people came to settle. All the administration was in Russian. Tatar language was not used as a language of administration. There were interpreters, but that wasn't part of the official language of this territory. The territory, I don't know if you, Karis, you can wave to me because you're the only one I see. Can you see my mouse on the screen or not? Right, so that is Crimea, that's Sebastopol, that's where Odessa is. Odessa is another large city that was built from scratch. The pearl of the Black Sea. It's like mini St. Petersburg, but without canals, very European in style. However, that was not the main port. The main port is here, Sebastopol. Also started at the time of Catherine the Great, as was the capital of the Crimea, Simferopol, where I'm from. So notice that part, please. You can see difference in color here. That is the part that went to Russia in 1654. That part went to Russia in 1770s. Cities started appearing 1783, 1784, Odessa 1790s. So that part became part of the Russian Empire thanks to Catherine. The Ottomans lost. Now Russia had a port on the Black Sea, the dream for generations to have a warm port. What happened after Catherine? For half a second, for 5 years, her son was on the throne, Paul I. Very unfortunate Paul I, who wanted to be the emperor desperately, waited until his mother died, age 66. By that time, he himself was well into his 40s, and he was killed in a coup, in a palace coup in 1801. And behind the coup were his own two sons, future two emperors of Russia. Maybe Catherine was not so wrong after all when she didn't want to step down and let Paul rule earlier. He was deemed to be a non-entity, basically. He was very pro-German. He idealized his late father. He thought that mother was a monster, usurped his throne, and whatever Catherine tried to do, she tried to do maybe in her own way some progressive things for Russia. He did exactly the opposite. So the whole government was so fed up that they decided to assassinate him, and he was killed in 1801, as I mentioned, with the blessing of his own children. The eldest son became an emperor, and the only thing that happened during Paul's time was the treaty with Caucasian countries, where Georgia, especially Georgia, is now. There was initially a treaty of protection, and then Russia just absorbed this territory. You can say nothing new, you heard about that before, but that's recent. We're talking now about 1790s. There was a treaty that Russia will just protect Christian brothers from Muslims in the south. Eventually, the treaty was disregarded, and Russia just absorbed Georgia, paid the money to Georgian princes to keep quiet, and took it within its borders. So Paul was assassinated in his castle. He built a castle in St. Petersburg. Winter Palace is this way. If you look at the canals, Winter Palace is that way as I'm pointing now. He built this fortress thinking it would save him. He knew he was not loved. It didn't. That's why he was killed. And the conspirators went on the back door to his bedroom, and in the middle of the night killed him in his own bedroom, where he was fighting, just hiding, not fighting back, just hiding in the fireplace, behind the fireplace screen. Rather evocative scene, I would have thought. So his son, his eldest son, Alexander I, became then, at the tender age, as you would say, of 24, the emperor. What is he mainly known is, first, Napoleonic Wars. Second, he did not have an heir. He didn't have a son. So his brother became an emperor after him. He was 22 years younger. And Alexander was known in Russian history, still is known as the handsome, Alexander the Handsome. Well, ladies, it's up to you to decide whether you think he is handsome. He certainly was deemed to be so by European beauties, especially French, after Napoleonic defeat, when the Russian army marched to Paris, and Nicholas the First then was later on, but at that time in 1814, 1815, it was Alexander the First, the Handsome, who impressed the nobility of Europe with his gallant manners, his ability to speak French, his understanding of European culture. And look at his uniform. Doesn't he look resplendent? Ladies in Paris thought he had the best thighs in France. So there you are. Very flattering uniform for somebody who has good figure. However, his military ability perhaps was not so great, but he had one great thing. He knew how to select a good general. Some of you may have seen War and Peace. There were several versions. The recent one was 4 years ago in 2016. And there was also BBC adaptation in 1970s, also very well done. There was also Russian done in 1960s. There is American with Audrey Hepburn. So you probably have seen one. And that's about Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and mainly also, of course, the invasion of Russia. The great general was Kutuzov, Mikhail Kutuzov. He was like our Nelson, if you wish. He also had one eye. He lost his eye in the Crimea during Crimean campaigns of Catherine the Great. By that time, he was considered old. If I'm not mistaken, he was in his late 60s by that time. He was short, he hardly washed, he ate peasant food, and he was brilliant military strategist. It was on his orders that Moscow was left to Napoleon. He took the army out, thinking that he needs to preserve his men, and eventually, under his auspices, Russian army won. And as you know, Napoleon was pushed back and eventually got his Waterloo from you. What happened after then the Napoleonic Wars? People settled back. One very important thing happened, and I want to bring your attention to that, ladies and gentlemen, because that's the beginning of the end of the Russian Empire. 1825. 1825. That was the year when Nicholas I came to the throne. His brother Alexander died childless. Nicholas was the next in line. That was the time when the first Russian Revolution happened. The first Russian Revolution happened. And what do we mean by the first Russian Revolution? We mean the Decembrist uprising. And the name Decembrist is because it happened in December. And that was the attempt to restrain the absolute monarchy. And it was a coup of aristocracy. Aristocracy and military generals military commands. However, it did not succeed. There was not enough support among ordinary people. They tried to bring constitutional monarchy like Britain had, for instance, at that time, never got to that point. Decembrists were defeated on the main square that is now called Decembrist Square. Then it was called Senate Square in St. Petersburg. And that's an impression of it, how it was happening. They were demanding that the absolute monarchy would be a little bit restrained and more rights given to a Senate that de jure existed, but de facto was not actually so powerful. And then, of course, what happens to people who lead coup that was unsuccessful? They have to be punished. 5 leaders were executed. That was the first attempt in the Russian history to do something about the absolute monarchy. There's a direct line from 1825 to 1917. Direct line. So that we learned the names of these people at school. We know about their heroic deeds. They're the other impression of 5 Decembrists that were eventually hanged. A lot of other participants were sent to Siberia on foot. Their wives, some wives were allowed to join them, and they brought some culture to Siberian places like Irkutsk, like Tobolsk. For example, they brought European culture there, imperial culture. Some of them lived long life. Some of them outlived Nicholas, for example. So not all were executed, only 5. And the event that you probably know better than me is this. Now we come to the last years of Nicholas's rule, and that's Crimean War. Recently, quite a lot's been mentioned about Crimean War because it was an anniversary of Florence Nightingale's birth, 200 years as Florence Nightingale was born, and there was a rerun about the Crimean War and her part in it, of course. Well, that's where I'm from. It's in Russian. That's the Crimea. That's Simferopol. That's my native place. That's Sebastopol, 40 miles away. And that's your famous Balaclava, which is a suburb 7 kilometers, 5 miles away from Sebastopol. There, a harbor. And that's where British troops landed. That's your idea of British invasion, from Istanbul to Varna and then to the Crimea. You heard enough probably during your lifetime, or if you're young, you will hear, no doubt, about the Crimean War. Very misnamed war in a way, because the military action took place in the Baltic. It took place in the Pacific, where Kamchatka Peninsula is, for example. It took place even as there were attempts even to distract certain actions along the Atlantic coast of America. So it was not purely Crimean War, but the siege of Sebastopol seemingly overshadowed the whole thing. And of course, the poem by Tennyson, Half a League, wrote the 600th. That was a big lesson to both sides. What did this war achieve? Not very much. What were the land gains? None. Britain lost thousands of people. Russia lost thousands of people. What was the result? Sebastopol was still there. They did not get Sebastopol out as the eye tooth of the bear, as it was called, Sebastopol. They didn't get the eye tooth of the bear out. It was still military base. But it also, in a way, brought the idea of a new warfare and, of course, new medicine. How to look after ill soldiers. Nightingale hospitals were built now. Sorry, probably you've seen during the coronavirus, they were called Nightingale hospitals. A great legacy. So what happens next? Just to mention that famous writer Tolstoy took part in it. That's him in his youth. Probably the most known Russian writer, Tolstoy. That's him in his youth as a dashing officer in the Crimea, and that's him later on in life. You would think he's a different person, wouldn't you? However, it's the same Count Lev Tolstoy. And that's War and Peace, Russian version, with Natasha being here. Natasha, and Russian Vronsky. Nicholas the First died during the war. Apparently, he was so heartbroken that Sebastopol fell after a year of siege that he just died of broken heart. He wasn't that old, actually. He was only in his late 50s. His son came to the throne. He is known as Tsar the Liberator. Now, just let's think for a moment. You all can read books. However, if I just ask you to think for a moment, was he right or was he wrong? You know, there is expression, there is no good deed goes unpunished, or the road to hell is built of good intentions. He known as Tsar the Liberator, who in 1861 liberated serfs, gave freedom to serfs. The serfdom was something that some of you asked me about. Serfdom was a system that kept peasants fixed to the land. The Russian word is not serfdom, it's fixed. The exact translation of the Russian word will be fixed to the land. These were people who initially were free peasants and had land, and then they eventually lands were absorbed by more loud, more bellicose landlords, feudals, who still gave peasants land as a rent, and peasants would work some days on the land belonging to the feudal person and some days on their own land, and also apart from working on land would pay tax for that. In theory, they could move. In practice, that became more and more difficult, and they became fixed to the land. That change in particular started happening by 1460s, 1470s, stronger and stronger. And eventually peasants could not change from one cruel feudal landlord to another. And the final removal of freedoms was only in 1649. There was no serfdom in Kievan Rus, for example. Peasants were free. There were slaves, but no serfs. So they were free. Then, in 18th century, it became more and more cruel. More and more money was needed, and the work of serfs became impossible. Like slaves, really, they worked extremely hard. They could be sold by now. They could be sold separately from their families. And the 19th century was in particular very bad for the serfs. They could be bought or sold in hundreds. They were called just souls. They were not people. They were souls for which money could be got. So Alexander liberated slaves. But what happened to them? Just think for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, what happened to them? They had nothing. Land stayed. Some of them could rent land if they could afford. But land that they were given now was taken. They had nothing, nowhere to live. What would happen to million free hands? They flocked to cities. They start looking for jobs. That was the period of industrialization of Russia. Russia was 100 years behind the Industrial Revolution. Factories, railways, mines, en masse. Millions of poor workers, mainly men, flocked to these places. That created great unrest. And what happened to the good Alexander? That's when his decree was read. Very few people could read, had to be read. What happened to the good Tsar? He was assassinated. He didn't do enough, or he did it wrong. So he was killed in St. Petersburg by a group of people who decided that they needed a person who would sacrifice his life, suicide bomber in effect, throw himself under the carriage of the Tsar, not far from Winter Palace. Winter Palace is behind this building. There is a Palace Square and Winter Palace. And that was the end of the great liberator, Tsar Alexander II. His son learned about it and became very reactionary, and they tightened the screws on all process of what could have happened in Russia. That's the Cathedral of Unspilled Blood that was built to commemorate the place where Alexander was assassinated. And this young man, you would not know, but his brother you certainly would. This is the older brother of Vladimir Lenin. Lenin, who was the father of revolution. Ulyanov, older Alexander Ulyanov, was executed, hanged for his participation in the anti-tsarist movement. He was in the group that tried to, he was too young to be directly in that group, but of a similar group that was called People's Will, and they were behind the assassination of Alexander. Any other attempt was suppressed cruelly. And Alexander III tried to suppress any thought of revolution, any thought of discontent. Here's young Lenin saying to his mother after the execution of his brother, "We shall go another way. Killing just the Tsar is wrong. We need to reform the mind of people. We need support. We need support." Here's Alexander III, known as the Bear, Tsar Bear. He was 6'6" nearly, was very able physically, died at age 49 of kidney failure. Now, how about that? And of course, you probably recognize this young man here. That's Alexander III, and that's unfortunate Nicholas here, son and heir. And he was the last Romanov. I'll just finish showing you a very poignant image. It's not brilliant photo, please forgive me. I took this picture. I am not a great photographer. I took it at the exhibition in the Queen's Gallery in London, which was in December 2018, of course. It's the wedding of Nicholas and Alexander. Very poignant picture. It's very large. It's nearly full size of figures. They're young. They're very hopeful. They wanted to live. They wanted to be happy, very much in love. The candlelight shining on their faces. The quality of painting is just amazing. And if you know, like we do now, what happened after, it makes a very painful expression of that. And here he is, Tsar Alexander, happily married at 26, and then who was forced to abdicate in February 1917. Very nice man, as a family man, loved his children, adored his wife, but we did not elect him to be a nice father. He was born to rule, and he was hopeless as a ruler. Russia was really in turmoil. They needed a strong hand, and they didn't have it. He got involved in the First World War, as you know, and we call in Russia his period 23 steps down. 23 years of his rule are often called 23 steps down. Who knows what would happen had we had a strong ruler? After all, the First World War put an end not just to the Russian Empire, it put an end to Austro-Hungarian Empire. It put an end to the German, rising German Empire, fairly new, Kaiser Empire. Ottoman Empire came to an end. Did he have to be executed? That's another matter, and we shall talk about it next week, about the 20th century of Russia, century of the last Tsar, the communists, and the oligarchs. So any questions, please, ladies and gentlemen? I will now stop sharing the screen. So if anybody has a question, please, we have a host who can put you on the microphone. Anybody who waves hands, and I will stop sharing. So you'll see it. I can see who is waving. Is anybody who is waving? I don't see all of you.
No.
I'm trying to see if anybody is waving to unmute you.
I think Karen was waving.
Karen.
Just a quick question. Can you tell us where most of them are buried? Are they buried in Moscow or St. Petersburg or?
You mean the last Tsar?
Well, any of them, yes, all of them, yeah.
Well, from Peter the Great onwards, they're buried in St. Petersburg in the memorial church in the fortress called Peter and Paul Fortress. It's the fortress that you can see from the Winter Palace. It's on nearby river, and that's the burial place of all Romanovs, including the last executed Nicholas, who was buried there in September 1998. So from Peter the Great onwards, they're buried there. Prior to that, they're buried in Moscow, in a memorial cemetery in Moscow. So Romanovs, mainly Romanovs, are all in St. Petersburg, and previous dynasty, the Ruriks, and then early Romanovs are in Moscow. Any more questions? If I explained everything so well, then I hope to see you next week for the century that probably is the most provocative, because this is still raw in our memory, and with what is going on currently in the world, even more so, with this just a juxtaposition of Russia, America, the West, the East. Let's not forget, history didn't start in 1917, it didn't start in 1991. The roots of this go right back to the time when we started talking about it, to Kievan Rus. So all being well, see you then. Thank you all very much. Спасибо большое. До свидания. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
bye.
Thank you, Olga.
Thank you.